Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Welcome to our stories of Pensacola, North America's first place city. And today we're again dealing with the second part of our story of the Spanish and the French along the Gulf Coast. In our first episode, we told the story of how the French had begun to develop an interest in the Gulf Coast through the voyage and the attempted settlement of Robert Sieur de La Salle. And then, of course, how the Viceroy in New Spain had discovered this and now was about to try to get the Spanish Council back in Madrid to take action so that the Spanish would return to the Gulf area, bearing in mind that there had not been a Spanish attempted settlement here since the failure of the De Luna expedition way back in 1561. Well, as we left our story the last time, Admiral de Pez, along with Father Seguenza, had visited all of the potential sites along the North Gulf and had come back, made their presentation to the Viceroy, who had then asked de Pez to prepare a plan of action, which he did. And at that point, de Pez was dispatched to Spain to present this idea and ask for funding and supplies from the Council. And of course, when he arrived, de Pez had to follow protocol. In those times, someone coming with a venture of his type was required, first of all, to visit the king, to make a courtesy call, if you will, and get his approval for what was being done, after which he would go to the council. Well, de Pez followed through, did as he was supposed to do, but unfortunately, King Carlos at that point was in one of his down periods. He was just not able to communicate at all, and so de Pez went forward and made his address to the king's council. Well, the council heard what he had to say. But they told him, frankly, we've got the concerns over what we're going to do in providing a new king when something happens to Carlos, and it's pretty obvious that this man's time on earth here is not for long. So we're sorry, we can do nothing about it. So on the other hand, I'll tell you what you do. You go back to North America, and there are one or two other points we would like to have you check on, just so we're really sure of what we're doing. Well, of course, this made de Pez feel very, very upset because he had worked out this master plan, but nonetheless, he had no choice. And so he returned. He answered the questions that the council had asked for, and then once again, with the Viceroy's approval, he returned to Spain. And once again, he made his call on the king. Now, this time, by now, the king was back in good shape. He was able to communicate well. He listened to de Pez's plan, and he gave it his full endorsement, said, go to the council and tell them that you have my full approval. Well, de Pez went to the council. Now, I don't know how many of you out in our audience today may have served in the military, but if you had, you recognize that running left end on the council would have been a very bad thing to do, but nonetheless, de Pez made his presentation, said, this is what I want to do. The king has approved it. The council said, well, I'll tell you what, we're still concerned about that. We have one or two more things we want you to go back and address. We can't give you the money yet. And so poor de Pez left, bringing that story again back to the Viceroy. This was twice he had been there now, and as a result, nothing was going to happen. He brought his story back, gave the information to the Viceroy, who again could take no action without council approval. Well, a year and a half went by. And at this point in time, the spies dealing from the Spanish government, and of course, just like today, there were spies just as we have them in the current times of here in the world today. The spies brought back a story to Madrid that was very disquieting to the council, because what they heard now was that King Louis XIV, had reviewed what had happened with the La Salle expedition and decided that they had to make a second effort, and they were about to put together a task force to come to the Gulf area and establish a French colony or colonies along the Gulf near the Mississippi River. Well, when that word reached the Spanish headquarters in Madrid, they said, well, we can't delay any further, and a messenger was quickly sent to the Viceroy in Mexico City, giving him the green light and the money to proceed with a colony. Well, the situation was basically this. The Viceroy had to have a leader, and he looked at various possibilities, and the man he selected was a man who had recently retired as the Admiral of the Treasure Fleet, that fleet that went from the Americas to Spain each year, gathered with all of the riches that had been put together through the year. This man's name was Andres de Areola. Actually, it's a little bit longer than Andres de Areola y Guzman, but we just always call, in Pensacola, we always just call him Areola. Well, Areola heard the proposition, and he said, "Sir, thank you. No, I'm not interested." I said, "I'm retired. I'm living on my orange grove here south of Mexico City. My wife is not well. No, I'm not your man." But apparently, the Viceroy had some leverage there, because after considerable debate, Areola accepted the job. And the position was, they are going to go where Depez and Siguenza had recommended, and they were still we're still calling this now Santa Maria de Galvez. We haven't made it Pensacola yet. That comes just a little bit later. Well, Areola begins his work. And the first thing he had to do, of course, was find manpower. And he was joined in this by a second Spanish captain named Jordan, and the two men began collecting the best people they could. Well, now we have to take a look at what was happening overall in Spain at this time. Not only Spain, but in Spanish Latin America. They had been working now for over 150 years, providing manpower for all sorts of colonies from Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America. And the Spanish manpower was beginning to run very thin. In addition to that, for reasons, of course, we have no explanation, the Spanish birth rate was declining. And so they had fewer males to send out. But in any event, the work began now of putting together a team, a colonial force to come to Santa Maria de Galvez. And what they had to finally put up with was this. Number one, they got about 150 Spanish soldiers. These were 150 men with the poorest fitness reports in the whole Spanish army in Mexico. They were not first-class quality people. In fact, they were so short on manpower that the final 150 that they took came from either Mexican or Cuban jails, literally. These were jailbirds that were put together, and now this 300 men were established and ready to go. And they left the Mexican headquarters in the early part of November of 1698. And they arrived here at Santa Maria de Galvez, or Pensacola, late in that month. Now, accompanying Jordan and Areola, and these 300 colonists, was an engineer, an Austrian by the name of Jaime Frank. And Frank's job was to supervise the building of a fort here at Pensacola, or whatever title we wish to use. And Jaime Frank came along. They finally landed, and the first question was, okay, we're here. Where are we going to put the settlement? Well, they had several options. One, of course, was to go where De Luna had gone, on the bluffs opposite what we call East Pensacola Heights today. Another was to put it on the Santa Rosa Island or the Santa Rosa Peninsula. And the third was to put it right at the mouth of the bay, where present day the Naval Air Station exists. Jaime Frank suggested going up on the bluffs. Areola said, no, the convenience factor for the Navy means we ought to put it right at the mouth of the bay. Jaime Frank said, I don't like that because it's a very difficult place to defend. Well, you know who was in charge. Areola was, and that's where they decided to put the colony. And so immediately the men began building their little huts. That was the first thing. They had to have a place to live. There was no Holiday Inn here waiting for them, so they got started. And it's one of those, the first thing Frank told the men was, now look, we have all kinds of space. Please, we're going to be building huts out of thatch and other very flammable materials. Don't put your buildings too close together. Did they listen? No. So they had been about 3 weeks into the process and had most of the outline of these little huts in place, when on a mid-December evening, a spark from one of the campfires hit one of the roofs, and sure enough, everything they had built just burned right to the ground. So they had to start all over again. It was a very inauspicious beginning, but they got started, and by the early part of January, they were coming along, and they had even started the foundations of what they were going to call Fort San Carlos, which of course was to be named for King Carlos. Meanwhile, back in France, the organization of Louis XIV's new colony was underway. And this time, Louis and his people were going to be very wise. They recognized that to send the wrong people was just not going to breed success. So what they chose as a team to lead were men not from France, but from French Canada. These were men whose family had been through the colonial effort. They had been Indian fighters. They were strong. They were very visionary. And so there were 4 brothers from the family of Lemoyne. And the 2 that we want to remember, we won't use all of their names, of course, but those who have traveled along the Gulf Coast will recognize the names Iberville and Bienville. These were two brothers, and these two men were to be in charge of the new colony. Iberville was the senior, and Bienville was his younger brother, and he was second in command. Now, these men put together the beginnings of their task force, and they had several vessels to work with. Now, one thing we want to remember is that the French at this time were working strictly out of their home country, not out of a satellite like Mexico, and they had anyone to choose from. And they were successful in getting all kinds of good people to come, people who were in the professions and the trades, and they also brought out, in the very first shipments, they came with women and families. And the ladies in the audience may remember back in the 1930s a wonderful musical motion picture that was done with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy called Naughty Marietta, and how the women came forth and how they blossomed when they got to the New World. Well, Naughty Marietta tilted the facts a good bit, but nonetheless, this was the idea, that was the theme of that movie, and it was actually what was happening here as the colony began. Well, the effort, the 5 ships of Areola, the Le Moynes left France and made their crossing, and of course they had no idea in the world that the Spanish were here in Pensacola. The Spanish had been there just about 6 weeks at this point, and Le Moyne and the two Le Moynes had recognized from other sailings that had been made by the French that probably trying to put a colony right at the mouth of the Mississippi would not be a very good thing, because it was a most unhealthful place. It was swampy or wet. So they had recognized Pensacola, or this area, as a desirable place, and this was where they were going to put their new city. So they sailed into the harbor here on the 26th day of January 1699, and both they were surprised and the Spanish were surprised to see them. Of course, the Spanish saw these ships coming and they thought, my gracious, the Viceroy has found new people for us already, and we've marked up more supplies. And of course, that was not at all the way it was. Well, Iberville and Bienville anchored, put a boat over the side, we got a bottle of wine and some nice sandwiches, came ashore, and they and Areola and Jamie Frank, they had a nice meeting. Both countries were at peace, and so they shook hands, and the French agreed that they would move on to the west, which is what they did. And so as they moved out, they moved along the coastline, and they stopped first of all in what we now call Mobile Bay. And they explored it, and they made a note that this is probably where we are going to put some kind of settlement. It's very close to the Spanish, but it's a desirable place. Then they moved a little bit to the west, and they came to what we today call Dauphin Island. They called it Massacre, and they said, this is another place where we ought to fortify this as a wonderful anchorage for our ships. They moved another 40 or 50 miles to the west and came to what we today call Biloxi. And they said, yes, this is where we want to start. And they put people ashore and began putting, hammering and sawing and so forth to make the first buildings for their colony. Some of the people were put ashore with them. And then 2 of the vessels moved further west, came to the Mississippi, and sailed north as far as present-day New Orleans. Now, bear in mind, they did not begin New Orleans then. That would not start for another almost 20 years. But nonetheless, they identified where they would like to have a city. So we moved back. Now the French are busy. They are putting together their little colony, their little settlement at Biloxi. They are fortifying and making a port out of Dauphin Island or Massacre, and they start building at Mobile. Meanwhile, back at Pensacola, Admiral Areola and the governor is having problems because the people are not happy. They're not happy to be there. The type of men that they had present were just certainly not the most desirable. And of course, beyond that, they had no priest. They had no women, of course, and the services that people would like to have, even in the beginning of a colony, were just absent. And so things went on day by day just that way. Areola, of course, by now begins to send messages back to the Viceroy, and the message are very, very critical of De Pez and Seguinza for their recommending this site, because, as Areola says, there's fever, there's no Indians to help us. It's just not the right place to be. And that's basically where things stood at the end of the year 1700.